Chief Mandela, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. I guess I'd start off by asking how the walk was this morning. What was going through your mind as you walked around some of the places that your grandfather's visited?
It was a wonderful walk for me, but most importantly, other than my grandfather, following my grandfather's footsteps and the places he visited, was the vibrant culture in Brixton. During my mother's stay here in London, in Leighton Buzzard, when I came to visit her, you would always hear and meet people out of Brixton. And they were a true embodiment of the black culture in London, and also a proud anti-apartheid activist voice. So to be here and to take a step back from living in my grandfather's footsteps and to look around and see the faces that were right in the forefront of our anti-apartheid struggle was humbling. And seeing people go through their daily lives and doing the work that they've been doing for decades leaves us very inspired as this young generation of the Mandelas. Oh. But to also then witness the places my grandfather has gone to, and to see not only him honored as the struggle icon for our struggle for liberation. We went to Walter Sisulu House, Albertina Sisulu House, and for us it is really humbling to see that our struggle icons have been given the necessary recognition for the work they've done. But to see Mama Albertina Sisulu's name there, it's also a very important thing for us, because this year, 2018, is not just the Nelson Mandela centennial year. In South Africa, we are also celebrating the Albertina Sisulu centennial year. Right. And ironically, she was the one in 1994 in Parliament of the Republic to nominate my grandfather for the position of president. So it was great to see the names of these icons being upheld here in Brixton.
Obviously, your grandfather's revered everywhere you go. I just wonder, from your perspective, what it's like to hear positive stories about him everywhere you go. What's it like for Chief Mandela?
You know, I travel extensively, and I think maybe one of the humbling moments I've ever had was to walk in the streets of Hebron in occupied Palestine. And I went into the market unpronounced, and I happened to meet an elder there that was seeing someone taking pictures of me. And they turned around and said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Chief Mandela." I said, "Mandela? Who are you to President Mandela?" I said, "He's my grandfather." And the man started weeping. Wow. And from that, it just spread in seconds. The entire market, from young people to elderly people, knew exactly who I was, and they were shouting, "Mandela, Mandela." And it made me connect to this legacy and what my grandfather's name and his life and legacy had become to ordinary citizens across the globe, particularly oppressed nations. And for me, growing up under that legacy, I used to be a young boy growing up in the dusty streets of Soweto that totally was disconnected to the name. When people celebrated or protested on June 16, and they were shouting, "Amandla," I thought, oh, they were calling out my name. But more profound to that, they would say, "Viva Mandela, viva." And I say, my name, my surname, in the same crowd. I must be the most popular kid. Yeah. So I'd run back home and tell my father this, and obviously my father would break down with laughter, you know. And then he sent me on a journey to really discover the man behind the name. And I was taken to Cape Town, received by my grandfather's friend, Dala Oma, and his lovely wife, Farida Oma. an Indian Muslim couple in Cape Town. They then took me to Paulsmoor Prison. And when I arrived in Paulsmoor Prison with Mamwini, we were put into the waiting room. But just the arrival at this prison, without having been briefed where we're going and been told who we're meeting, I started seeing bars on every window and bars on every door. And thousands of questions started running in my head. What are we doing in a prison? Why have we come to a prison? And while seated in the waiting room, I heard the voice of a very inquisitive man. Oh, Warden, how are you? How's your family? I haven't seen you in a while. How's that legal matter I was assisting you with? And obviously the man was responding as this voice continued prompting questions. But this voice came closer and closer to the door. And suddenly a giant leaped into the room. And Mamwini was very excited, and they were hugging and kissing with my grandfather. Suddenly, Madiba then turns around and says, "You must be my grandson." And I thought to myself, am I hearing right? This man just said he's my grandfather. And I became very withdrawn and very bitter, because for me, a prison was for someone who had done wrong in society. And I just thought in the terms of my grandfather was a criminal and had shamed the family. But he could see these emotions, because I became very withdrawn. I had one-word answers as we engaged. And having left there, instead of discovering the man behind the name, I became very bitter, very angry. And my father realized that it didn't serve its purpose. So Madiba, being the wise person that he was, he immediately saw what was happening and wrote a letter to a friend of his and comrade of his, Helen Joseph, who was a white woman. Says, "Dear Helen, I've just had a visit from my grandson, who is the heir of the family. But I'm rather concerned. His English was very backward. Please assist in his development." So naturally, Helen Joseph receives this letter and invites me to her house and says, your grandfather has sent a letter to me, and she gives me the letter. Says, "What do you make out of this letter?" I say, "Well, my grandfather thinks my English is very backward. So he's looking to you to assist in my development." Then she laughs. She says, "Well, let me tell you something. This is exactly what the apartheid regime thought. This is why this letter is not censored. Letters that come from your grandfather are usually marked out in black or the entire paragraph cut out. But this, because they didn't understand it's a coded letter, Madiba said you went to visit him and you didn't know the man he was, the ideals and the principles that he stood for, his commitment to the struggle for liberation, and he's asked me to educate you about the man he was." That was very profound to me. White people were an expression of oppression to me. And here's my grandfather reaching out to a white woman for my own development. And I owe all the knowledge I have today to the likes of Helen Joseph, Joel Joffe, Mary Benson, who actually lived here in London, O.R. Tambo, Adelaide Tambo. They played a crucial role in my own development and understanding of the challenges of the past.
My last question, just before I move on and let everybody else take the floor. You have the exhibition here next year. Talk about the significance of the exhibition and what you hope people will take from it.
Well, for us as the Royal House of Mandela, this is the official exhibition on my grandfather's life and legacy. So we are wanting to take a different approach than what you've constantly seen to portray Madiba as the family man, his traditions, his culture that informed him to be this global icon. So you will see for the first time a lot that has been done in Madiba's early years. A lot of people read The Long Walk to Freedom, first 2-3 chapters. They are lost and disconnected what Madiba is trying to define in terms of his own traditions and cultural roots where he comes from. So we'll be focusing on the early years of Madiba, and then the struggle is my life years upon arriving in Johannesburg, and his political activism. Then again, that is defined by a number of places in terms of the Defiance Campaign, Treason Trial, Sharpeville, and the final capture of Madiba in Howick, as well as him being brought from the 5-year sentence he was serving into the Rivonia trial, because there was a handbook that was discovered at Rivonia that implicated him in the case, and therefore he was brought in as accused number one. We will also be looking at Madiba's prison years and the impact it had on the family, the application that he made wanting to give his mother a respectful and dignified burial. He was not allowed to bury his mother. Also, the loss of his eldest son, Tembekile, in 1969. He was also not allowed to give his son a dignified burial. So we will look at the prison years, which will then bring us to the release of my grandfather, how that came about, not only at the hands of the South African community in South Africa, but South Africans living in exile. The African countries that rallied in our support. You would know that my grandfather, before he was incarcerated for life, had gone out to mobilize African countries in our support and visited about 16 countries, ending his visit here in London. We will then look at the role of those African countries, as well as the international solidarity movement and the Release Mandela campaign, which for me was exciting times, because I attended 1 or 2 protests in those times. My mother, Nolusapo Mandela Perry, used to live here in London in Leighton Buzzard, and she was an anti-apartheid activist with Judith Perry, an aunt of mine. My mother had been married into that family. And they would go into Trafalgar Square and stand in front of South Africa House protesting, and I would be able to see what the international community was doing for us. And therefore, to have this freedom today, and many people say 1990 was really freedom. Some of us as South Africans continue to say, oh no, Madiba was released in 1994. Political parties were unbanned in 1990. Political prisoners were released in 1990. South Africans living in exile were allowed to return back to South Africa. But for 4 years, up to 1994, a lot of blood was spilled. You have the Bisho massacre, Boipatong massacre, and a number of conflicts that arise. Probably between that era of 1990 to 1994, a lot more people died than the period of 1960 to 1990. Right. So we want to uncover some of those challenges through the exhibition. And then to speak about 1994, the ability to vote and giving birth to a new dawn, a new democratic, free society. My grandfather's presidential years, 1994 to 1999. And then look at healing a nation and nation building. How Madiba was able to use sport to unify South Africans. But also after presidential years, we would want to look at how Madiba dedicated the rest of his life to humanitarian efforts, and thus ensuring that we close the exhibition with bidding farewell to Madiba. He passed on the 5th of December 2013, and for 10 days, South Africa and the world was in mourning as we prepared to take Madiba to his final resting place in Nkulu. I, for one, stood side by side with him for those 10 days. I was with him when he was lying in state for 3 days at the Union buildings. And to witness heads of states, people from all walks of lives across the global community queuing for hours just to come and pay respects and pay farewell to Madiba was a very humbling experience, but also it enlightened me about the depthness of the man Madiba was, not only to us as a family or South Africans, but to Africans and the global community. So what is this exhibition seeking to do? I believe not just to inspire people, but it needs to instill courage within today's leadership to act upon their decisions. One of my sad moments was to witness the United Nations unveiling a statue of my grandfather. And I said to myself, if we are only honoring Madiba with statues and then do not uphold his principles and ideals, we've totally misplaced who the man was. The United Nations takes a resolution on Palestine, yet they do not implement it. They take a resolution on the Western Sahara, they fail to implement it. These are the issues Madiba was passionate and was outspoken about. As you know, when he visited Palestine in Gaza in 1995, he said, our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. And we, this young generation, owe it to ourselves to pick up the baton where he left off and continue charging forward, being the voice for human rights, peace, and justice in the world.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're having the world premiere here in London out of everywhere in the world. So what was the reason behind, what was London's allure or the connection that you felt?
I think most importantly, London for us has been probably the real place of activism and of the anti-apartheid campaign against the brutal, oppressive regime of South Africa. But also this is where the height of the Release Mandela campaign was witnessed with the concert that was held at Wembley Stadium on Madiba's 70th birthday in 1988, June of 1988. But it is also of significance to my immediate family, myself and my mother. As I said, my mother used to be lived here in England for 9 years, 6 years here in London, and then 3 years in Manchester. And she was in the forefront of the anti-apartheid campaign as encouraged by Oliver Tambo and Adelaide Tambo. And my mother with Aunt Judith Perry used to be protesters at Trafalgar Square in front of South Africa House. So this year when we celebrated our centenary of Madiba's 100 years, in his birthplace in Mvezo on July 18, where my mother is the current chief. You would know that I was actually put on the position in April 2007, but then I was sent to Parliament in May 2009, and my mother has been leading Madiba's birthplace since. And when she spoke about honoring the life and legacy of Madiba, she says, you know, I would like to see who we can get from Wembley Stadium that performed there to come and perform in Madiba's birthplace. And my mother was the only family member that attended the concert. So she became the focal point, and we said, who was there? And she says, you know, for me, either than Tracy Chapman, it would be Mahotela Queens that stole the show there. So we ran to get hold of Mahotela Queens, and they performed at Madiba's centenary. but it shows how much the British citizenry committed itself to the international solidarity movement. It's different when we speak to the British government. As you know, Margaret Thatcher regime, in one of the protests, they took a picture of my mother protesting in front of Trafalgar Square. And Margaret Thatcher was asked, what do you have to say about, we believe it's one of Madiba's daughters that is here. And she said, in response to that, Mandela must take his kids off our streets. So, for us, we have fond memories of those experiences. And I actually saw in one of the pictures our guide was showing us the bust that was put of my grandfather. On one year I came, it must have been in 89, when I came to meet with Adelaide Tambo and Oliver Tambo. They took me to the statue that had been vandalized. So the head was off, but the wall was still standing. I took picture there as a 15-year-old boy and shattered that people could do this to a man who had been incarcerated for the right ideals. I think my grandfather stood on the dock and said, I have fought against white domination and I have fought against black domination. And in his life, even post his release, he lived through that. And I think the overemphasis that Madiba represented a struggle of the oppressed masses of South Africa is probably telling half of the story. Madiba liberated the oppressors themselves. And that's the uniqueness of the man. If you meet people like Christo, the warden at Robben Island, Christo will tell you that we were the men to break down this Rivonia trialists. We were set out to bury them on this island. Instead, their remarkable humility towards us forced us to find one another, to build friendships. And Madiba actually became one of our legal representative. While he was in prison, he would give us legal advice as to how to engage on some of the matters. Today, Christo is an advocate for the Palestinians, and he speaks on the Palestinian cause. And for me, that is why we say as a family, it's truly important to showcase that this freedom was not just at our hands exerting pressure on the apartheid regime, but it came at the assistance of the international community. And this is why we are coming to London for the first launch of this exhibition.
If I'm sitting here in 20 years' time and this situation is taking place with your grandson, what would your legacy, what would you like your grandson to be talking about in terms of your legacy?
I wouldn't want to even think that I have a legacy, but I think the next generations of the Mandelas to come ought to continue on the work that my grandfather championed. My grandfather dedicated 67 years of his life serving humanity. And the United Nations has embraced his birthday, July 18, as the International Nelson Mandela Day, which is therefore a global calling for everyone across the globe to dedicate 67 minutes on the day serving their communities. And for us as a family, it is a calling of service. If there's anything that I can sum up my grandfather's life to be, he's been a man of service. He's served humanity. And therefore, we want to continue to be the voice. We want to continue serving our communities, serving South Africa, serving the African continent. I have an opportunity not only to be a traditional leader of Madiba's birthplace, but since May 2009, I'm serving in the South African National Assembly as a deployee of the African National Congress. Since October last year, I'm now serving in the Pan-African Parliament and therefore having a greater voice in the continent. And I believe that generations from now in the Mandela family need to continue with that work. being of service to the humanity, upholding human rights, peace and justice throughout the world.